for young women, it's already like 3% here. So this is a striking fact. Part of it is in survey data. Kenyan adolescents, teenagers, in terms of survey data, the best sort of survey data we can get, we think there's probably lots of misreporting in these kinds of surveys, but the best data we can get, women report higher rates of sexual activity in this age group than men, so that's got to be part of it. Some of this could be voluntary choice, some of this could be rape or coerced sex. There's a lot of reasons why some of these women might be more sexually active than men. Then we see a big increase in prevalence over time, and it sort of plateaus, and then we see declines when we get into the 40s and onward. What are a couple of reasons, or any reason why prevalence might be lower for this older group? Yeah. So mortality could be a reason. You know, maybe these guys 20 years earlier had infection rates that were similar, but they died. The people who were HIV positive, many of them died off, so now the prevalence rate is lower. And the reason why that's relevant, especially when we're looking, I picked 2003 in part because of where it stands in relation to when antiretrovirals became available in Kenya. So antiretrovirals only started becoming widely available after 2003. So the 2003 DHS is one of the last years before there was widespread access to these treatments that can prolong life massively if you're HIV positive. What's another reason why these folks may have lower infection rates? Yeah?
Selection bias. We can see what particular groups of people were in that 25% that might possibly be the role.
That's right. So to the extent that potentially these older folks, look, I'm not taking the blood test, or the selection into who gives the blood test is much more serious among the older folks, that could be part of it too. What's a third reason?
By the time HIV became kind of prevalent, they already gotten to enormous.
Exactly. So HIV starts spreading in Kenya in the 80s. Some of these folks may have been in their mid to late 20s in a monogamous relationship, having fewer partners and therefore much less likely to be infected. So that's what economists would call, or demographers would call, a cohort effect. This was just a cohort that was less exposed than the cohort that came with age, say, in the 90s. So there are just three very good reasons you guys have said for why you might see this kind of time pattern. Now, with the spread of antiretrovirals and less of a mortality effect, as was mentioned before, you might expect this to flatten out, right? Because now folks who got infected in their 20s would still be alive 20 years later, let's say. So you might expect it to flatten out. You might also expect there to be different time patterns across cohorts based on differences in risky sexual practices across cohorts. If the folks in their 20s today are having less unprotected sex than people were 25 years ago before they fully understood the risks of unprotected sex, then you might see lower prevalence among younger people today. So there's a lot of different factors governing these kinds of patterns. I'm going to mention one thing related to the youth, and this is related to, or comes from a paper by Pascaline Dupas, who's at Stanford. And she makes this observation. She looked at this age group and basically collected some survey data and others have done, asking about whom these young girls are having sex with, trying to understand who their partners are. It turns out the vast majority of these 15 to 19-year-old girls who are, say, in secondary school are having sex with men who are at least several years older than them. So Pascaline actually has a paper where she does a health education campaign among these girls, where she encourages these girls. She says, look, if you're already sexually active, I'm not going to tell you not to be sexually active. But don't have sex with these older men, because she showed them this plot. She said, look, these older men are infected. Have sex with the boys in your class. There were many happy boys in these communities. It was a very well-received sort of program, yeah. Yeah, that's really the risk. And in the next lecture, we're going to write a formal model about the decision whether or not to have risky sex. And this exact issue is going to be central to the model, where if people are taking into account the costs and benefits of their actions, if ARVs are available and HIV isn't a death sentence, it's just much less costly to have unprotected sex, because it's not going to be a death sentence. So it's definitely something that's been commented on for a long time. There have been a number of studies in the U.S. There have been public health studies about the rate of unprotected sex or protected sex among gay males in the U.S., showing that after ARVs became available, unprotected sex became much more common than it had been in the 90s when HIV/AIDS was a death, when HIV was basically a death sentence. So it's definitely an issue that is very relevant. So we'll talk about that. That's going to be very important for us. Okay, clicker question. One more thing about the patterns of the disease and who's infected. Using the same data I just showed you, if you look at households that are wealthier, let me turn on the poll, sorry. If you look at households that are wealthier and households that are poor, which of them have higher HIV prevalence? The wealthier households, or is prevalence lower among the wealthier households? Is it roughly equal, or do we just not believe the data? Is the data just too unreliable? What are people's views on that? Okay, so let's look at the results. And there's a general view that HIV rates, prevalence will be lower among wealthier households, or roughly equal. Not that many people think it's higher among wealthier households. Some people think the data is too unreliable, maybe related to these selection issues. So I'm actually glad now. I'm going to use this clicker question thing. A lot of us read about HIV in the news. It's a huge public policy issue, and even among very educated folks here interested in development, you guys thought prevalence was 2 to 3 times the rate it is. You thought men were more likely to be infected than women, and you think poor people are more likely to be infected. All three of those are wrong. Richer people are much more likely to be infected with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa. So usually I ask these questions, you guys get them all right. So I'm feeling like we're definitely in new territory here, which is good. So what are the basic patterns? The main reason why we're going to find the wealth effects and education effects we find, which is going to be wealthier people being more likely to be infected, more educated people being more likely to be infected, has to do with the urban-rural difference. So urban infection rates are much higher than rural infection rates, and they have been throughout the epidemic. Part of this has to do with the fact that people in urban areas tend to have more sexual partners in survey data. There's more density, there's more potential partners, there's very often greater availability of the commercial sex sector. So for all those reasons, and maybe others, there's higher rates of infection in urban areas. But this pattern of the sort of positive socioeconomic gradient, meaning better off people being more infected, was observed even very early on in the epidemic. So there's famous stories by early public health researchers about the spread of the disease in sub-Saharan Africa, showing that HIV infection rates among truck drivers, say, was very high. And the reason why is truck drivers spend a lot of time away from home. They often have many partners. They also tend to be relatively well off if they have a job driving a truck in a formal company. They have salary. So they're away from home. They have a salary, and a very high proportion of them engaged in or sort of had contact with commercial sex workers. So they had very high infection rates. soldiers in the early surveys tended to have very high infection rates. Again, soldiers tended to be men with salaries away from home for extended periods who had lots of contact with commercial sex workers who tended to have high infection rates. So it wasn't poor rural residents who were necessarily coming into contact with the virus in the early stages of the epidemic. This is the wealth result, and you can see among the lowest quintile, about 3 or 4% are infected, and among the highest quintiles, the highest fifth, it was 10% infected. So really, really big differences. When we talk about Rebecca Thornton's paper, which takes place in rural Malawi, her rates of infection are closer to these 3 or 4% infection rates. So the kind of rural poor in Kenya looks similar to the rural poor in Malawi with lower infection rates. Better off people in cities with better jobs tend to have higher infection rates. And if you look at the average number of sexual partners, wealthier people tend to have more sexual partners too. So there's differences in sexual behavior that correlate with these sorts of patterns. Now, one other pattern is worth bearing in mind. Remember, in week 2 of the course, we talked about Bloom and Sachs, and we said, tropical regions of Africa are poorer than non-tropical regions. These areas in southern Africa, like South Africa and whatnot, Botswana, tend to be these better off parts of sub-Saharan Africa in terms of per capita income. So not only are richer people within societies more likely to be infected, richer countries tend to have higher infection rates too. Southern Africa is the richest sub-region in Africa. They have the highest HIV infection rates. Eastern Africa is the second richest region. They have the median infection rates. And West Africa tends to be the poorest region in sub-Saharan Africa. They have the lowest infection rates. So this kind of gradient from lower socioeconomic status and lower income having the lowest infection rates, and richer areas and richer people within countries having higher infection rates comes through in a couple of different dimensions across countries, across individuals. Yeah. You might, for a lot of health problems, richer people have better health outcomes. And so I think that's why this is so interesting. That's why I'm emphasizing it. If I said, what is the proportion of rich people and poor people in Kenya who get cholera? It's not going to have this pattern, or intestinal worms. But for HIV, it has this sort of counterintuitive pattern, and it really has to do with sexual behavior. Now, there is a question about knowledge of the disease, and even at the time of this survey, in the early 2000s, when surveys were run in Kenya asking people like, have you heard of HIV, and do you know if it's spread through unprotected sex? The vast majority of Kenyans in all regions and groups knew that. So there was some basic knowledge about the risks of unprotected sex that were already out there by the time of this survey. These infections, though, don't just reflect knowledge at that time point. They also reflect behavior that may have taken place 10 years before. So there was a hand up over here. Yeah. So you're saying put region dummies or region fixed effects in and see if you find this relationship. Yeah, so it isn't done that way in this day. So you're sort of saying, like, okay, within Nairobi, let's say, are the richer or poor people more likely to be infected? I'm not sure exactly what those patterns look like. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Uh-huh. Maybe. In terms of that paper, when we get to the model, I think we'll be able to talk through some of the mechanisms, and we'll try to think about how being richer or poor affects your decision making. So you're onto something important, but we'll get to it. I think it'll make more sense to circle back to it in the next lecture when we walk through the framework a little bit more. Yeah.
Can you speak to the quality of sex education? Because I wonder if the presence that you were told that if it were in fact poor right now, if it were improved in the future, that would affect the distribution also.
I think the consensus, Pascal Dupas has also done some work on sex education, a randomized evaluation of sex education in Kenya, finding pretty minimal effects, to be honest. But the sex education curriculum is, the official curriculum, I know this just having read her paper and talking to her about it, is very conservative. It's very limited. They don't go into tremendous detail, or the kind of detail you might want to go into to give people the tools they need to avoid HIV. So my recollection from her paper is, in the official curriculum and the official training manuals for the teachers, who are the sex education teachers, they're not allowed to mention condoms, but if a student asks about condoms, they're allowed to talk about it. That's kind of the rule. So it's in the curriculum, but it's sort of not encouraged, and so it's a little bit of a limited curriculum. So I think that's part of the problem. That said, like I mentioned, surveys even in 2003 indicated people knew unprotected sex without a condom was a risky thing in terms of HIV infection. So people are learning about it outside of the schools. So at the same time that the schools have this very limited and kind of probably not that effective sex education campaign, there were lots of NGOs and and others putting up public service messages on radio, TV, and billboards that were much more explicit about how to avoid HIV at the same time in Kenya. So the word is out. The word has long been out in Kenya about the risks of HIV. There's almost a reverse problem with some of those early public health messages. And we'll come back to this when we talk about the model. This interesting point was brought in about how people factor in risk, and that's going to be central to this model. But some of the early public health campaigns, and I remember this from the late 90s, were just so stark and aggressive. They basically said, like, if you have unprotected sex, you're at tremendous risk of getting HIV, and if you do, you're going to die. It was just so bold that I think a lot of people thought, wow, I had unprotected sex once last year. Oh, I must be HIV positive. And the truth is, in any one sexual act, the risk of transmission is very low. So probably the reason, going back to the point I made right when we were starting the lecture, that when you ask Kenyans what you think the infection rate is, they say 30%, 40%. Part of it may be due to these campaigns that really almost exaggerate the risk of infection. And when we talk about the model, the behavioral model, we'll see how that can backfire. Because if you think you're already infected, you may have nothing to lose. And that nothing to lose effect is going to be a kind of tension in the model. So we'll talk about these trade-offs in the next lecture. Yeah. Yeah.
What do we call good sex?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So when you had sex education in school, they talk about abstinence rather than condoms. Yeah, and I think that's the official curriculum. So one of the countries people talk about is actually Kenya's neighbor, Uganda. So Uganda had very high rates of HIV in the 1980s. And again, part of that could be the proximity to the source of the infection. Part of it could be the political instability in Uganda during this period, the Tanzanian invasion in '79, all these sorts of things. People point to a lot of factors. But the government curriculum and the official government public health messages in Uganda were much more explicit about condom use than the sorts of official government messages in Kenya. And it was interesting working in 97, 98, 99 in Busia, Kenya, because Busia is literally on the border with Uganda. So we would get Ugandan radio and Kenyan radio. And at that time, with KBC, there was almost no real serious, under Moy, there was almost no serious discussion of HIV. It was really a taboo subject. So, but the Ugandan radio, I remember every third or fourth, commercial would be a public health message from Uganda, being extremely explicit. Use condoms, do X, Y, and Z, limit, be faithful, do all these kinds of things. So, people point to Uganda as a success story because they started having many fewer additional infections relative to their neighbors. Now, whether that was due to the public health campaign or not is a little hard to say, but many people have pointed to this very open discussion as being part of the story. Okay, so what about the impact of HIV? We've talked about how widespread it is, and we've kind of had some brief discussion about why it's spreading. We're going to come back to that a lot more in the next lecture. What I want to talk about is the impact, and this is going to be very important for this course because we want to ask the question, for instance, if we look at Africa's poor economic growth performance, say in the 1990s, was the outbreak of the HIV in the 80s and 90s, was the outbreak of the HIV epidemic in the 80s and 90s part of the story? Is that part of the reason why economic growth rates fell? Another question many people have asked. And so let's just kind of step back for a second. What are some of the channels through which you might think that the HIV/AIDS epidemic could affect economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa? What are some of the direct sorts of channels or effects you would think of? Yeah. Yeah, so this is something we talked about a little bit. We talked about the Solo model. So if you think of mortality going up, so you have let's say a skilled worker, an investment has been made in their skills, and they die. So you lose a productive worker, and you lose all that sort of investment in human capital. These very crude terms in terms of the model, but that's something you would see. So you basically are losing skilled labor. I want to build on one thing you said, which is you said something about a shorter life expectancy. Now that has a direct effect. Is there an indirect effect, not just through the loss of a skilled worker in the economy? Is there an indirect effect of a shorter life expectancy?
Shorter planning horizon, higher discovery, less people investing in their own surrounding infrastructure.
That's right. So mortality going up means maybe first of all this direct loss of skilled labor, and the second one is less incentive to invest. So going back to this point, just raised before about people fearing their own infection status or thinking they're very likely to be infected. If 30 or 40% of people think they're likely to be infected and they may only live X number of years, maybe they won't invest in human capital, maybe they won't start a small business, maybe there's a whole bunch of different economic decisions that could be altered by thinking you have very short time horizons. This second effect may be just as important as the first one or more. So these are two very important effects. Roxanne, do you have your hand up too?
I was going to say labor productivity too, like within the workplace, as the disease progresses, they be able to produce less output, and that's impact on economic development.
That's right. So even short of mortality, there's morbidity or illness, and morbidity could affect labor productivity. In fact, that's the first kind of channel we're going to look at when we talk about the Fox et al. Study. So morbidity, HIV/AIDS-related morbidity can affect labor productivity, and the mortality can have these multiple effects. Okay, so there's a range of effects. The mortality then affects the next generation. So there's the issue of AIDS orphans. Basically, as parents become sick and die, kids may be much more likely to live in poor households. There may only be one parent, or the kids may end up in effectively a foster family with fewer resources. And even beyond the resources, even if they end up in a family where there are enough resources, their parent isn't there to look out for them and care for them and whatnot. So, the human capital, the nutrition, the development of the next generation could get affected here as well. Yeah. And let me say one more thing, which is the patterns of mortality, where you often have what are called prime age adults, people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s dying, makes it different than most mortality. Most mortality occurs either very early in life, there's very high infant mortality in poor countries, or in old age. But now with HIV, you have lots of mortality among prime age adults, and that makes this death different because very often these prime age adults are taking care of children, taking care of their parents, so many dependents are directly affected by this health problem. I see. Well, you're making a really interesting point, because if we're saying, given a certain amount of income, people are investing less, that means they're probably consuming more, right? So I don't think there's the kind of data we would need to test your point, but it's a very interesting one, and it flows directly from this kind of view of the world. So that's a good point. Yeah. So even beyond the orphans, just a broader effect on family members. So not just the kids, but maybe the siblings of the person who dies of AIDS has to take care of the kids, has to take on other responsibilities. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's right. So to the extent that there's lots of health expenditures, which is basically consumption. That's right. Okay. Yeah. So this is a really interesting point. So all of a sudden, the public health budget, which was already stretched thin, dealing with malaria and cholera and all kinds of vaccination campaigns and other things, is stretched that much thinner because there are massive HIV/AIDS-related health expenditures to deal with. So there are public finance implications of this, and maybe implications for tax rates, etc. Yeah. So this is a very interesting point, which is the offsetting effect of these expenditures. Is if all these expenditures are financed through donor assistance, there'd be less of a burden. And in fact, several of the largest new foreign aid programs over the last decade were linked to HIV/AIDS. So there's something called PEPFAR that the U.S. government spent on, which I think is the President's something initiative for AIDS. I don't know what the acronym is. Once there's more than 3 letters or 4 letters. But there have been very large amounts of, say, U.S. government spending, billions of dollars of U.S. government spending.